What raised the need to create a standard for communication among platforms?
The National Association of Realtors identified the need for standards early on in 1999. The Real Estate Standards Organization was born out of that. The acronym for it is RESO, or RESO, and RESO's purpose is to drive a standard called RETS. RETS, and that stands for Real Estate Transaction Standard. The RETS format is basically a protocol that allows interoperability between software programs and creates a common language for all of the participants in real estate technology to move data back and forth between different products. The RESO organization has been a growing organization. The board of directors for RESO includes many of the top technology companies in the United States. Move, Realtor.com, and ListHub have been very heavily involved in RESO since its inception. The ListHub head of product, Mark Wise, has been had a seat on the RESO board for many, many years. So what we find in the U.S. is that this standard is driven primarily by the technology companies that have the best visibility into what they need RETS to do for them and what the customers are asking for. So we meet on a regular basis and move the spec forward to accommodate more and more and more use cases.
Was there a single standard before your advent?
RESO came out before, for example, the ListHub business was formed. However, it's important to understand that the technology companies like ListHub are very important drivers to move that standard forward and evolve it. So, for example, there was already a RETS format when ListHub was formed. However, there was not a good way to use RETS to distribute listings for advertising purposes. And so ListHub was a very big part of working with the RESO organization to make changes and develop what we call the RETS syndication spec, which is part of the RETS spec, but it's specifically for advertising purposes. So this is a great example of how the RESO organization and technology vendors work together to make it all better and evolve it over time.
As we look at your codes, we see property uniqueness and geolocalization as the start point. Why are they so crucial?
They are really crucial and helpful in identifying properties within the United States. We have about 800 different multiple listing services around the U.S., and each one houses a database of all of the properties that are for sale in the region. Within each multiple listing service, every property has a unique identifier, the MLS ID. And by identifying the MLS and identifying the property by the MLS ID number, that gives us a positive identity of the property that's for sale within all other software systems that depend on the MLS data to power them.
What three items deserve attention in the standardization process?
There are a few things that we've learned in the U.S. about the standardization process that I think everybody could benefit from. One is related to the MLSs and the MLS ID numbers. By using an MLS ID number as the identifier of the property, the challenge with this is that since we have 800 different MLSs, it's possible for two different MLSs to contain the same MLS ID number. So therefore, it might be helpful to consider in pursuing a new standard to think about the value of a property-based system where the actual plot of land is documented centrally as opposed to identified within a regional multiple listing service. So that's one thing that I would think is a very, very important piece to consider in forming a new standard. The second thing that I would consider as being an important part of standardization is local nuances. So for example, in the US, the multiple listing services are all very different, and each one identifies different property types and property characteristics differently. For example, in one MLS, The system may be to describe a property as a townhome. Meanwhile, in another MLS, the same property might be described as a condominium. So arriving at common language is going to require a certain amount of reconciliation of the different local differences from MLS to MLS to MLS and from region to region to region. Another good example of this is within the US. In some states, we have regions that are referred to as counties, whereas in other states, those same types of regions are referred to as parishes. And so this is another example of regional differences that need to be reconciled through the data standard format. And I would say that the third important thing to consider is the importance of adoption. So all of the work that's done to create a standard and to reconcile local differences are no good if the biggest companies for technology and the biggest companies providing advertising for the properties aren't using the standard. So it's really, really important that the leaders in technology and in software and in media are adopting these and driving the adoption with other companies as well. So having a strategy in place to make sure that the leaders are engaged and that there is a commitment to adopting these standards is an important part of the process.